I have with me today Ambassador Ashok Kantha. He was India's ambassador to Sri Lanka, China, and he was also Secretary East at the Ministry of External Affairs. Presently, he is director at the Institute of Chinese Studies. Welcome to the print, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Nayanima.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for talking to us. So, of course, what is happening in Sri Lanka is something that India is closely watching, and which is why we are having this conversation with you, because you know Sri Lanka in and out. So my first question to you will be, sir, what is there in everybody's mind that after the resignation of Mahinda Rajapaksa as the Prime Minister there, is it really sort of end of the dynasty, end of the Rajapaksas as far as Sri Lanka is concerned?
No, I would not like to look at these developments in that context. Yes, I mean, there is a political transition taking place, no doubt about it. What we are looking at today is a combination of an unprecedented economic crisis, which is described as the worst since independence of Sri Lanka in 1948, which has triggered a political crisis, which in turn has become a political stalemate. So how to get out of this current predicament is a huge challenge for Sri Lanka. As you know, there has been hemorrhaging of political support for them. There's no doubt about it. It's reflected in massive demonstrations which are taking place all over Sri Lanka. These demonstrations were by and large peaceful until day before yesterday, when we had incidents which triggered violence. So really what we are concerned about, all friends of Sri Lanka are concerned about, is that Sri Lanka, which is such an important neighboring country, a country with which we share extensive strategic, security, economic, political, and societal links, how does it come out of the present crisis? And India would like to be of whatever stance it can be, especially when it comes to the economic dimension of Sri Lanka's crisis today.
Mm-hmm. Sir, I'll come to the fact that how India is sort of helping and what is going on, especially as you said, the implications for India. But let us just first understand what is really happening there. I mean, Mahinda Rajapaksa was this character, is a character who was the supreme leader. He was credited for ending the civil war there, having Prabhakaran eliminated, so to say. Do you see now the kind of reports that are emerging also from Sri Lanka that he probably has, fled the country and it is his downfall? How do you see that transformation as far as Mahinda Rajapaksa is concerned?
There are reports suggesting that he has moved to the Sri Lankan Navy base in Trincomalee. Our High Commission in Colombo denied certain rumors which are floating around that he has fled to India. I don't think that's the correct news. But as I mentioned earlier, there is no doubt that Mahinda Rajapaksa, who has been a charismatic leader, who has extensive support in the past, especially in the Sinhala Buddhist constituency, right. Support base among the minority communities, Tamils and Muslims alike, and Christians, has been very limited. But the support base, even among the majority Sinhala Buddhist community, has been greatly eroded as a result of developments of the recent past. So that's a political fact we need to sort of acknowledge. Mm-hmm. Why it has happened, frankly, it's a combination of factors. There were certain legacy issues behind the economic crisis, which was building up for quite some time. It's a combination of structural problems in the economy, impact of series of developments like Easter Sunday bombings in 2019, COVID beginning 2020, and Ukrainian crisis, beginning February this year, and some very serious mismanaged economy and endemic corruption, for which blame is being put on the Rajapaksas today.
So you think their kind of, yes, their economic policies, and also the fact that too much of vegetarianism is also, these are the reasons that is why we are seeing this unprecedented crisis in Sri Lanka. Is that, are those the reasons?
As I mentioned, it's a combination of reasons,
Of all this?
factors.
Hmm.
There is an economic crisis which has led to political crisis and stalemate today,
Hmm.
and the demand from the street, as also from various other major stakeholders of society, including the opposition parties, from the civic society organizations, bar association, trade unions, is
Right.
that both Gotabaya Rajpaksha and Mahinda Rajpaksha should step down. Prime Minister Mahinda Rajpaksha has already stepped down. The demand for President also stepping down is continuing, which he has indicated he's not inclined to do that. So there is really, as I mentioned earlier, I'll reiterate that there's a stalemate, political stalemate. There's no government in position in Sri Lanka today, with the exception of president. That's not a tenable situation. When the country is engaged in coping with an economic crisis of unprecedented dimensions, what they need, first of all, is an interim political dispensation, an interim government which can take some very difficult decisions. It's really a challenging period for Sri Lanka. How to put in place such a government which can be a government of national unity or whatever, is something which cannot be delayed, cannot be postponed.
So, but then, do you think it will be that easy to sort of let, have President Gotabaya Rajapaksa resign? Because as far as I know, the impeachment process is extremely strenuous and it is tedious, but the demand of him also stepping down is escalating. So even if there is an interim government, it has to be under him. And if it is under him, do you think these protesters, people will agree to that?
It's very difficult for me to comment on that, whether protesters will agree or not. So far, they're staying firm on the demand that president should step down. But as you rightly pointed out, there is a process of impeachment of president laid down in Sri Lankan constitution, which is very complex and time consuming. Plus, it's far from clear that the opposition has the requisite numbers in parliament to bring about such an impeachment. So situation is extremely complex today. It's uncertain. So frankly, it's not for us sitting in India to comment on that. These are internal domestic processes in Sri Lanka, where decision can be taken only by the people of Sri Lanka, working in accordance with democratic processes. As the spokesperson of Ministry of External Affairs remarked yesterday, India is looking at the interest of Sri Lanka, and it expects that the democratic processes will lead to resolution of the current political stalemate, and in turn economic crisis in Sri Lanka.
Sir, you are also our ambassador to China. You would know China also as much in depth as you understand Sri Lanka. Now, China has also been blamed a lot for this crisis. We've seen how the Rajapaksa government was again tilting towards China with the port city coming up and several other investment projects. But firstly, sir, do you think China is also somewhat responsible amongst all other factors that you have talked about? And also, after this crisis, how do you think they will be now taking the next steps? Will they continue with their investments? What is it that you think China will do?
China has undoubtedly contributed to the present, crisis in economic crisis in Sri Lanka. After the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka in 2009, when I was in Colombo, at that time, then President Mahinda Rajapaksa opted for an economic developmental model which was fueled by external commercial borrowings, including large borrowings from China. He opted for projects which are not economically viable, including Hambantota Port, Matala Rajpaksha International Airport, subsequently Port City project, and these projects have not really yielded economic dividends. They have contributed to Sri Lanka's economic difficulties today, and they have also proved to be a debt trap. I have no doubt about it. You look at what happened in case of Hambantota Airport, which was given on a 99-year lease to Chinese entities because Sri Lankan government was not in a position to service the debt it owed to China. Moving ahead, looking at the current situation also, I think some of the advice coming from China has not been helpful at all. Instead of providing emergency support to Sri Lanka, China opposed restructuring of debt. It was not in favor of Sri Lanka going to International Monetary Fund, which was delayed. On both these two issues, India has been fully supportive of Sri Lanka. India, as you know, has intervened with IMF and tried to persuade IMF to come up with emergency assistance for Sri Lanka, because we realize that even though India will be the first responder and has been the first responder in keeping with its neighborhood first policy, by way of providing emergency economic assistance to Sri Lanka, which is in the tune of $3.5 billion this year alone. We cannot, do it on our own. So Sri Lanka needs to work out arrangements with IMF, World Bank, ADB, as well as with other partner countries. So that process has to move ahead. But as I mentioned earlier, that process can take place, can proceed apace only when the current political stalemate is broken and there is a government in place in Colombo.
So that's right, because that's also the concern that is now sort of emerging in Sri Lanka, that with this kind of political turmoil and crisis, international agencies like the IMF, World Bank won't be that forthcoming with a sort of financial package. Now, if they don't come through, and the situation, as you're saying, with this political stalemate ongoing, there is a commentary that is emerging that probably Sri Lanka is headed for another civil war. Do you see, is your assessment also like that?
No, I will not. I will not rush to any such conclusion. I think Sri Lanka has suffered enough through an extended or rather extended periods of civil war. You had the anti-JVP operations in 1970s and 80s, and then you had the civil war against and involving LTT. I don't think Sri Lanka can afford to go through another such wrenching process. And Sri Lanka it's a mature country and society. I believe they have the requisite resilience and wherewithal to cope with present challenges. It might take some time. Economic crisis will require, its management will require an extended period of transition. It will require a number of very difficult decisions, because some of the mistakes done in the past, including a major slashing of revenue sources in late 2019 will have to be reversed, because Sri Lanka has been living beyond its means, both in terms of domestic resources and its excessive reliance on external borrowing. External debt is in excess of 120% of GDP, which is unsustainable. So a number of tough decisions will have to be taken. But I'm quite hopeful that Sri Lanka will be able to undertake these painful decisions and get out of the current multiple crises.
So now coming to the implications for India. Now, as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned, sir, we were looking at resuming some of the projects there, like the Trincomalee oil farms. External Affairs Minister was also there, and he also talked about expediting some of the projects that we are engaged there, especially with the West Coast Terminal and other projects. Also, there was an NSA dialogue that was a trilateral, which India, Sri Lanka, Maldives. How do you think all that will now shape up? Where is all that headed? A, and B, sir, in terms of security, Sri Lanka is not just any island. It is hugely strategically important for India. The shipping lines all cross through there. India is also dependent on that. So how do you see that scenario evolving, and how that can impact us directly?
You know, all those projects which have been talked about, and some of those projects were really inordinately delayed, not because of any lack of will on our part, but the requisite decisions could not be taken on the Sri Lankan side. I think there's need to see that those projects, whether it's Trincomalee oil tank farm project, or various energy projects, connectivity projects, they need to progress and implement it effectively, as we have done in case of other projects. For instance, the project on construction of 50,000 houses in Sri Lanka, which was started when I was High Commissioner in Colombo. That's a success story, and it has not placed any burden whatsoever on Sri Lankan coffers, because it was a grant from the government of India as a support to people of Sri Lanka. So I think those projects need to progress as and when the present situation stabilizes. The way I look at it, economic engagement with India by way of investment, two-way investment flows, closer connectivity, exploitation of synergies that we have between India and Sri Lanka, all that will be a very important component of the revival package Sri Lanka will develop. It will not be based only on restructuring of debt and IMF package. IMF package, though important, will not be a panacea. Sri Lanka has gone through arrangements with IMF 15 or 16 times in the past, so it's not something new. At this point of time, it's really required. That's why we are supporting it. But much more needs to be done. So we need to see that for the development of Sri Lanka, cooperation with India is a true engine of growth. And this is something which will bring benefits and dividends on both sides.
So then lastly,
let me just come. I didn't respond to your question on security and strategic interests. That's again, it's a very important dimension of our relationship with Sri Lanka. Security interests of India and Sri Lanka are closely interlinked. There's no doubt about it. We are also traditionally, we are the largest provider of military training to Sri Lanka. We have stepped in from time to time with support of other kind, including in area of maritime domain awareness. I think that cooperation, which is already very substantive between India and Sri Lanka, needs to be continued apace and indeed stepped up.
That's what I was also going to ask you, sir, in a larger format, as far as security is concerned. I mean, for India, purely from India's perspective, you're seeing, this situation in Sri Lanka, and then there is in Afghanistan, the situation is hugely tense since last year with the Taliban coming in. In Pakistan, yes, there's a new government, but there's still instability. Overall, how do you see and of course, let us not even go into what's happening with China. The standoff is still on. It's going to be 2 years. So do you think this is probably the time for India to give a more serious relook at the neighborhood first policy? What is it that do you think that India should be doing, especially at a time when in the backdrop, Ukraine war is also going on?
As you very rightly pointed out, we have a very complex situation, both in our immediate neighborhood as well as globally. You know, India's neighborhood policy, first policy, is eminently sensible and needs to be continued. There's no doubt about it. But situations that we have vis-a-vis major, neighbors, whether it's China or Afghanistan or Sri Lanka, these are all different situations. So we do not club them together. Restricting myself here to Sri Lanka, I think a basic strand of our policy, which has unfolded in recent weeks, is that we will continue to be the first responder as part of our neighborhood policy, first policy, and provide whatever economic support and succor we can extend at this point of time. But our support is going to the people of Sri Lanka. There's absolutely no attempt on our part to prop up any particular political dispensation in Sri Lanka. It's for people of Sri Lanka to decide what kind of government they will have. It's not for India to interfere or intervene in those processes, the democratic processes. So I think that differentiation is being maintained very clearly by the government of India today in terms of providing support to Sri Lanka as a country, as a society, to the Sri Lankan people, while at the same time, not seeking to prop up any particular dispensation in Colombo, letting the people of Sri Lanka decide that through their domestic democratic processes.
Mm-hmm. So since you said that, one last question just to on that point, the opposition parties in Sri Lanka are now demanding that there should be, they will do away with this, their 20th amendment in their constitution where president has all the power and, sort of distributed and relegated to the parliament. Do you think that will be something that will now happen there?
That's a long-standing demand in Sri Lanka, that executive presidency should be done away with. And in the past, actually, virtually all political parties have supported that. You had the 19th Amendment in 2015, which amended the Sri Lankan constitution and diluted executive presidency, restored greater balance, more checks and balances in political arrangements. But with 20th Amendment to the Constitution in 2020, that was sort of rolled back. Once again, there is a strong and growing demand that 20th Amendment needs to be reviewed, and executive presidency needs to be done away with. So it's really, as I mentioned earlier, is for the people of Sri Lanka through their democratic processes decide on those questions, not for us sitting outside to give any advice on those very important issues.
So, but then what happens to India's demand in terms of implementing the 13th Amendment for the Tamil reconciliation? Does that now again goes into, up in air? Nobody knows what will happen to that.
13th Amendment is to the Constitution is very different because India has a locus standi there. It flows out of agreement we had in 1987. So we were party to that agreement. 13th Amendment has only been partially implemented while provincial councils have been created in many areas like land and law and order. Powers that were supposed to be transferred to provinces has not been done. And in fact, in some areas, there has been a dilution of even what had been implemented earlier. So it has been a long-standing request to the government of Sri Lanka that the 13th Amendment should be implemented. Indeed, I recall from my days in Colombo that then President Mahinda Rajapaksa had assured us on many occasions that he will not only implement 13th Amendment, but go beyond that. Unfortunately, those commitments were not delivered upon.
So I think now we have to again wait for yet another, the stability to come there when we can move ahead on that proposal.
Exactly. I think the immediate concern is how do we see the current political stalemate being overcome our government being put in position in Sri Lanka, and then dealing with the economic challenges. But as we deal with those issues, it's very important to bear in mind that the process of reconciliation, of ensuring that all communities in Sri Lanka, all ethnic groups in Sri Lanka, they're taken as equal stakeholders and equal partners in Sri Lankan society. That process also moves ahead. That is taking time. That has not been done with a sense of urgency as we hoped and expected. But once we get out of the current crisis, I think that process of reconciliation, of reaching out to all communities needs to be brought back on track. And here, let me just make one more point. One silver lining in the current multiple crisis situation in Sri Lanka is that demand for systemic change is being made cutting across the ethnic divide. All major communities, whether the Sinhalese or Tamils, Muslims and Christians, they're all getting together and making that demand. That's a reassuring phenomenon.
Yes, that's very key. But thank you so much, Ambassador Kantha, for all those insights that you've told us and to give a perspective as to how the situation has evolved there and probably what's next for Sri Lanka. So thank you for talking to us, sir. You please take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.